Everyone mocked the fat, rejected bride until he shouted, "Stop! She's mine now!" The church bell tolled. Whispers filled the pews, and a young woman stood trembling at the altar, publicly humiliated, laughed at by the whole town. But when a rugged rancher rose to his feet, everything stopped. One word from him silenced the mockery and bound her fate to his. She thought the worst was behind her, but the ranch house held cold stares, bitter resentment, and a land war ready to erupt. Behind every slammed door and every cruel whisper was a secret. Railroad men plotting fire in the night, neighbors ready to turn, and an old treaty that could change everything. What happens when the woman no one wanted must stand before an entire town and decide whether she'll break beneath their scorn or rise and save them all? Will love and courage be enough to silence the jeers forever, or will the frontier swallow her last chance at dignity? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wooden wheels of Robert Hale's wagon creaked through the darkness, each turn marking the distance from the church where Abby's world had shattered and reformed in the space of mere minutes. The autumn air bit at her cheeks, still damp with tears, as she gripped her thin shawl tighter. Her wedding dress, sewn with such hope, now felt like a costume in a cruel play. Robert sat beside her, straight-backed and silent, his strong hands steady on the reins. The horse's hooves clip-clopped against the packed earth, a rhythm that matched Abby's racing heart. She stole glances at his profile, trying to understand the man who had claimed her so boldly before the whole congregation. The echoes of laughter still rang in her ears, the mocking faces, the whispers, the way her intended groom had stepped back with such public disgust. But then Robert's voice had cut through it all, deep and commanding. "Stop! She's mine now!" The memory made her shiver, though whether from fear or something else, she couldn't say. "Cold?" Robert asked, his first word since they'd left the church steps. "No. Yes. I mean, a little," Abby stammered, cursing her nervous tongue. She had always struggled to find the right words when flustered, and tonight had left her more rattled than ever before. Without taking his eyes from the dark road ahead, Robert reached behind the wagon seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He draped it across her lap with one hand, his movements efficient and practical. The gesture, though simple, brought fresh tears to Abby's eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown her even this small kindness? "Much obliged," she whispered, running her fingers along the blanket's rough edge. It smelled of horses and hay, honest ranch smells that somehow steadied her racing thoughts. The wagon rolled past the last scattered buildings of town, where lamplight still glowed in windows. Abby imagined the gossip already spreading like wildfire. How Robert Hale had stepped in to marry the rejected bride, how plain Abby Mayfield had somehow snared one of the territory's most respected ranchers. The thought made her stomach clench. "Mr. Hale," she began, then faltered. How did one even begin such a conversation? I need to know. Why did you do it?" The wagon wheels hit a rut, jostling them both. Robert adjusted his grip on the reins before answering. "Couldn't stand to see it," he said finally, his voice low but clear in the night air. "Weren't right, what they were doing to you." "But you didn't have to marry me," Abby pressed, needing to understand. "You could have just spoken up, stopped the laughter." "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." His words were firm, brooking no argument. "A woman like you deserves better than mockery, better than a coward who'd shame her before God and everybody." Abby's hands twisted in her lap, crumpling the blanket. "A woman like me," she echoed, the old hurt rising in her throat. "Plain. Plump. The woman no man wants?" The bitter words spilled out before she could stop them. Robert's jaw tightened, visible even in the dim starlight. "No," he said, and there was anger in his voice, not at her, she realized, but at those who had branded her with such cruel labels. A woman who holds her head high even when folks are being their worst. A woman who's kind to every person she meets, even them that don't deserve it. I've watched you, Miss Mayfield, Ms. Hale now these past months, seen how you treat people, seen your worth, even if others were too blind to it. The simple honesty in his words struck Abby speechless. She had never thought anyone had noticed her at all, except to judge her failures. But Robert had seen her, really seen her, and found something worthy. The revelation made her chest ache with an emotion she couldn't name. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon leaving the main road for a narrower trail. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the prairie grass that stretched away on either side. In the distance, a coyote called, lonely and wild. "My ranch ain't much," Robert said eventually, gesturing ahead where a darker shape rose against the star-scattered sky. "But it's good land, with strong water rights. Been working it 15 years now since Sarah passed." Abby's heart stuttered at the mention of his late wife. Everyone knew the story, how Robert had lost her to fever just 2 years after they'd settled the land, leaving him alone with an infant son to raise. "Your boy," she said carefully. "Tommy, he's 12 now." Robert nodded. 13 come spring. Good boy, works hard." He paused, then added quietly, "He needs a mother's hand, though." "Been too long with just me." The weight of what that meant settled over Abby like another blanket. This wasn't just about saving her from humiliation. Robert was trusting her with his son, his home, the life he'd built from nothing but determination and grit. "I don't know much about ranching," she admitted, feeling she owed him the truth. "But I'm willing to learn. I can cook and keep accounts, and I'm strong enough for work. I won't be a burden, I promise you that." "Never thought you would be," Robert said simply. The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly the ranch house was clear before them, a solid 2-story structure of squared logs, with a broad porch and a lamp still burning in one window. A barn loomed darker behind it, and various outbuildings clustered around like chicks around a mother hen. As Robert drew the wagon to a halt in the yard, Abby saw a gangly figure emerge from the house, Tommy, she presumed, coming to see what had kept his father so late at church. The boy stopped short at the sight of her, his mouth falling open in surprise. "Pa?" he called uncertainly. "What's—" "Tommy," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "Come meet your new mother. Ms. Abby Hale." Abby held her breath as the boy approached, his steps hesitant. In the lamplight from the window, she could see Sarah in his features, the same delicate nose and chin that she remembered from years ago, before the fever took her friend. The thought steadied her somehow. Perhaps this was why God had brought her here, to care for Sarah's child. "Hello, Tommy," she said softly, forcing herself to smile despite her nervousness. "I hope we can be friends." The boy looked from her to his father, confusion clear on his young face. But there was no rejection there, no disgust like she'd seen in the church, just uncertainty, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. Robert stepped down from the wagon and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her down. His grip was strong and sure, and for the first time since this strange evening began, Abby felt something like peace settle over her. This wasn't the marriage she'd dreamed of, but perhaps it could become something real and true, built on respect and shared purpose rather than romantic notions. As her feet touched the earth of what was now her home, Abby straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had been broken by mockery and rejection, but she would not stay broken. Robert had given her a chance at a new life, and she would make the most of it, for herself, for him, and for the boy who watched them with such wondering eyes. The night wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying away the last echoes of cruel laughter and bringing instead the promise of tomorrow. The wagon rattled along the darkened road, every bump and dip making Abby sway on the hard wooden seat. The moon cast enough light to show the path ahead, but shadows cloaked the rolling prairie on either side. Robert handled the reins with quiet confidence, guiding the horses around the worst of the ruts without comment. Abby's hands twisted in her lap, her wedding dress now wrinkled and dusty from the journey. The events at the church played over and over in her mind, the cruel laughter, the burning shame, and then Robert's thunderous voice claiming her as his wife. It felt like a dream, yet the man beside her was solid and real. The silence stretched between them until Abby could bear it no longer. "Mr. Hale," she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to understand. Why would you bind yourself to a stranger?" Robert kept his eyes on the road, but his shoulders tensed slightly at her question. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Been watching them treat you poorly these past months. Wasn't right. A man can't call himself Christian and stand by while folks tear down another soul." "So it was. Mercy?" Abby's throat tightened around the word. Part of her had hoped for more, though she could hardly blame him for acting out of charity. "Reckon you could call it that." Robert adjusted his grip on the reins. Didn't plan on marrying again, truth be told. But sometimes the Lord puts a clear choice before us. Couldn't watch them break a good woman's spirit just because they're mean-hearted. Abby nodded, drawing her shawl tighter despite the mild evening. At least he was honest about his motivations. She would rather know she was an act of Christian charity than live with false hopes. The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly a cluster of buildings appeared ahead. The Hale Ranch. The main house was substantial, 2 stories of solid construction with a wraparound porch. Moonlight gleamed off the windows, and a lamp still burned in one of them. Several outbuildings and corrals spread out behind it, and the bulk of the barn loomed dark against the star-filled sky. As they drew closer, the front door opened, spilling lamplight onto the porch. A tall figure stepped out. A young man in his early 20s, his stance rigid with surprise and something that looked like anger. Robert drew the wagon to a halt in the yard. "Evening, Thomas," he called out, his voice carrying a note of authority Abby hadn't heard before. Thomas Hale strode down the porch steps, his boots striking the wooden planks sharply. "Pa, what's this about?" "Tell me you haven't." He broke off as he reached the wagon, getting his first clear look at Abby. His face darkened. "You actually did it? You married the rejected bride?" The cruel nickname stabbed through Abby's chest like a physical pain. She forced herself to sit straight, though she wanted to shrink away from his scorn. "That's enough," Robert said sharply. "This is your new mother, and you'll show her proper respect." "Mother?" Thomas spat the word like poison. "She's barely older than me. Have you lost your senses completely, Pa?" Robert stepped down from the wagon, his movements deliberate. "Mrs. Hale is my wife now, Thomas. That's the end of it. Help her down from the wagon and bring in her things." For a moment, Thomas looked like he might refuse. Then, with visible reluctance, he extended his hand to Abby. His grip was barely there, dropping her hand the instant her feet touched the ground. Without a word, he grabbed her small carpet bag from the wagon bed and stalked toward the house. Inside, the main room was neat but sparse, with a stone fireplace, a square table with 4 chairs, and a few pieces of well-worn furniture. A kettle hung cold in the fireplace, and unwashed dishes sat stacked by a dry sink. "I'll heat up some supper," Robert said, moving to the kitchen area. "Thomas, show Mrs. Hale where things are kept." Thomas crossed his arms. "She can look for herself. I've got work to finish in the barn." "Thomas." Robert's voice held a warning. With visible reluctance, Thomas pointed to various cupboards. "Dishes there. Pans there. Flour and such in the pantry. Water pumps out back." Each word came out clipped and cold. Abby tried to smile. "Thank you. I'm sure I'll find my way around." Thomas's only response was a scowl before he turned and left, letting the door slam behind him. Robert sighed heavily. "He'll come around. Just needs time." Abby nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She had hoped, but no, it was foolish to expect instant acceptance. She moved to help Robert with the supper preparations, falling into the familiar routine of cooking, despite the strangeness of the kitchen. Soon they sat at the table, bowls of reheated stew before them. Thomas had returned, but he kept his eyes fixed on his food, refusing to look at either of them. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against bowls and the tick of a clock on the mantel. Abby tried to eat, but each bite stuck in her throat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She found herself studying the water stains on the ceiling, the worn spots in the tablecloth, anything to avoid meeting Thomas's hostile gaze when he occasionally glanced her way. After what felt like hours, Robert pushed back from the table. "I'll show you to your room," he said to Abby. "Thomas, clean up here." Thomas's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "Sure. Wouldn't want the new missus to soil her hands?" "That's enough," Robert said, but Thomas was already gathering the bowls with sharp movements that made them clatter dangerously. Robert led Abby up a narrow staircase to the second floor. The wood creaked under their feet as they passed 2 closed doors before stopping at a third. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table holding a lamp. A window looked out over the yard and the distant prairie beyond. Someone, Robert, she supposed, had laid out fresh linens and even placed a small vase of dried prairie flowers on the dresser. "Thank you," Abby said softly. "It's very nice." Robert nodded. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." He hesitated, then added, "I know this isn't what you planned for your life, Mrs. Hale, but I aim to be a good husband to you." Before Abby could respond, he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the hallway. She stood alone in the quiet room, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of her new home. Moving to the window, Abby looked out at the ranch that was now supposedly hers. The moon illuminated the yard, where shadow shapes of barns and corrals stretched into the darkness. Beyond them, the prairie rolled away to the horizon, vast and unknown. Sinking to her knees beside the bed, Abby clasped her hands together. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "grant me courage for whatever lies ahead. Help me find my place here, even if—" She swallowed hard. "Even if I'm not truly wanted." A night bird called somewhere in the darkness, its cry lonely and wild. Abby remained kneeling, her prayer trailing into silence as she contemplated the strange turns her life had taken. Outside her window, the fences and buildings stood like sentinels, marking the boundaries of her new world. A world where she was still an outsider, still unwanted, but perhaps, with God's help, not entirely alone. The first pale light of dawn crept through Abby's window, followed moments later by the shrill cry of roosters. She blinked awake, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar room. Then, yesterday's events crashed over her like a wave. The humiliation at the altar, Robert's unexpected rescue, and Thomas's cold welcome. Abby pushed back the quilt and dressed quickly in her plainest work dress. If she was to be the mistress of this ranch, she would not start by lying abed like a lady of leisure. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way downstairs, trying to move quietly through the silent house. The kitchen stood empty, though she could hear movement from the yard. The men would already be starting their day's work. Abby took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. Time to prove she wasn't useless. The water pump stood in the backyard, its iron handle gleaming with morning dew. Abby gripped it firmly and pushed down, but nothing happened. She tried again, throwing more weight behind it. The handle moved grudgingly, but no water appeared. Red-faced, she struggled with it until suddenly a deep voice spoke behind her. "You need to prime it first." She turned to find Robert watching her, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward and poured a dipper of water down the pump's throat. A few steady strokes later, clear water gushed forth. "Thank you," Abby mumbled, cheeks burning. "I'm afraid I don't know much about ranch work yet." "You'll learn." Robert's voice held no judgment. "The bread box is empty. Reckon we could use some fresh loaves." Abby nodded gratefully. At least that was something she knew how to do. But as she measured flour and yeast, she could hear whispers from the bunkhouse through the open kitchen window. "Married her out of pure spite, I figure. Show them townfolk they can't mock a Hale. Or maybe Christian charity. Everyone knows no other man would take the fat rejected bride." The words stung like nettles. Abby's hands trembled as she kneaded the dough, working it perhaps harder than necessary. She would not cry. She would not. The morning wore on. After setting the bread to rise, Abby gathered her courage and headed for the barn. The milk cow needed tending, and she was determined to learn. The spotted cow regarded her with suspicious eyes as Abby approached with the milk pail. "Nice girl," Abby murmured, trying to sound confident. "Let's be friends, shall we?" The cow shifted restlessly as Abby positioned the stool. Her first attempts at milking produced nothing but frustrated snorts from the cow. The teats seemed to slip through her fingers, and when she finally got a grip, only a thin stream trickled into the pail. "Well, would you look at that?" Thomas's mocking voice came from the barn door. "The city girl trying to milk old Bessie. Better watch out. She kicks when she's annoyed." As if on cue, the cow's tail whipped across Abby's face. She sputtered, losing her grip on the teats entirely. "That's enough, Thomas." Robert appeared like a shadow in the doorway. "Instead of standing there making smart remarks, why don't you show your mother how it's done proper?" Thomas's face darkened at the word mother, but Robert's stern look brooked no argument. With visible reluctance, Thomas moved to Abby's side. "You're gripping wrong," he said shortly. "Like this." His hands demonstrated the proper motion. Firm but gentle. "Roll, don't pull." Abby watched carefully, determined to learn. When she tried again, a steady stream of milk hit the pail. "Thank you," she said softly. Thomas grunted and walked away, but Abby caught Robert's slight nod of approval. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of chores. Abby's arms ached from pumping water, her back protested from bending over the washtub, and her hands were red from scrubbing. But slowly, surely, she began to find her rhythm. The bread came out golden brown, filling the kitchen with its homey scent. She managed to gather eggs without getting pecked too badly. Even the cow seemed less hostile during the afternoon milking. But it was the whispers that wore at her most. They followed her like shadows, the ranch hand's speculation about Robert's motives, the lingering echo of that hateful nickname. Each time she heard it, determination burned a little brighter in her chest. She would show them all. As evening approached, Abby surveyed the kitchen's meager supplies. The stew pot caught her eye. Her mother had always said a good stew could warm both belly and spirit. She set to work, chopping vegetables with careful precision, adding herbs from the small kitchen garden, letting the meat simmer until it was tender enough to fall apart. The sun was setting when the men tramped in from the fields. Robert's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the laden table, fresh bread, butter from the morning's milk, and a pot of fragrant stew. Thomas dropped into his chair with his usual scowl, but it faded slightly at the first spoonful. He took another bite, then another. The silence felt different now, less hostile, more appreciative. "This is good," he said finally, the words seeming to surprise even him. His eyes met Abby's for the first time without scorn, holding just a hint of reluctant respect. "Thank you," Abby replied quietly. Under the table, her hands were trembling from exhaustion, but her heart felt lighter than it had all day. Later, alone in her room, every muscle in her body protested as she sank onto the bed. Her hands were chapped, her feet ached, and she had a scratch across one cheek from the chicken coop. But as she looked out at the star-filled sky, a small smile touched her lips. One day. She had survived one day, and tomorrow she would do better. They might have married her out of pity or spite, but she would earn her place here through sheer determination. The cruel whispers might continue, but she would answer them with work and patience and carefully seasoned stew. Abby crawled beneath the quilt, her tired body surrendering to sleep even as her mind catalogued tomorrow's tasks. She had much to learn, but she had made a start. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough to build on. The days settled into a steady rhythm at the Hale Ranch, each sunrise bringing new challenges and small victories for Abby. Her fingers grew more nimble with the leather harnesses, learning to feel where stitches needed reinforcing before they could snap under strain. The horses came to know her touch as she fed them their morning grain, no longer shying away when she approached with brush or curry comb. In the kitchen, Abby mastered the art of ranch cooking, turning out enormous pots of beans and towers of biscuits to feed the hungry hands. She learned to gauge exactly how much coffee to brew for the morning rush, and which men preferred their eggs turned over hard or running soft. Even Thomas had stopped making snide remarks about her cooking, though his acceptance remained as thin as spring ice. But the real test came when supplies ran low, forcing a trip into town. Abby's stomach churned as Robert helped her into the wagon. The mercantile bells jingled as she pushed open the door, and the chattering inside dropped to whispers. "Look who's here!" A woman's voice carried clearly across the shop floor. The rejected bride who trapped Robert Hale. Abby kept her chin up as she made her way to the fabric counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the calico prints, selecting a sturdy blue cotton for new work dresses. Behind her, tittering laughter rose and fell like wind through dry grass. "I heard she bewitched him somehow," another voice stage whispered. "No other explanation for why a man like Robert Hale would take her." "Heard she can't even properly milk a cow," someone else added with a snicker. "What kind of rancher's wife is that?" Abby's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to measure the fabric carefully, adding some sturdy muslin for sheets and extra buttons for Robert's shirts. She would not let them see how their words wounded her. Mrs. Peterson, the mercantile owner's wife, took her sweet time cutting the fabric, making Abby stand there while the whispers continued. When she finally named the total, her voice dripped with false sympathy. "Are you sure you can afford all this, dear? Times must be difficult with your situation." "The Hale Ranch account is good," Abby replied quietly but firmly. "Please add a pound of coffee and some sugar as well." The drive home seemed longer than usual, dust coating Abby's throat as she held back tears. Robert glanced at her occasionally but said nothing until they were almost home. Then he pulled the wagon to a stop in a shady spot. "You did well in there," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Standing your ground." Abby stared at her hands folded in her lap. "They think I tricked you somehow, that I'm not fit to be a rancher's wife." "What they think doesn't matter." Robert turned to face her fully. "I've watched you these past weeks. You've got more strength in you than anyone gives you credit for. More than most of those gossips who've never done a real day's work in their lives." The unexpected praise brought fresh tears to Abby's eyes, but these were different somehow. Robert awkwardly patted her shoulder before clucking to the horses to move on. That evening, as Abby was setting out supper, sharp knocking echoed through the house. Robert opened the door to reveal 3 Apache men, their faces weathered by sun and wind. Abby recognized the eldest as Grey Wolf, who sometimes traded with the ranch. "Water flows strong at Eagle Spring," Grey Wolf said without preamble. "Good for your cattle." But white men with measuring tools walk near the creek. They carry papers with iron horse drawings. Robert's shoulders tensed. "Railroad surveyors? When did you see them?" 2 suns ago. They measure, they write. They talk of tracks and stations. Grey Wolf's dark eyes were serious. "They say the iron horse needs much water." Abby stepped forward, gesturing to the kitchen. Please, come sit. I have fresh coffee and bread." The men exchanged glances, then followed her inside. Abby poured coffee into her best cups, setting out butter and still warm bread. She noticed how they watched her movements, assessing her as carefully as she assessed them. Grey Wolf accepted the coffee with a slight nod. "You're new here, the rancher's woman." "Yes," Abby replied simply. "I am learning your land's ways." "Land teaches those who listen," Grey Wolf said. He broke off a piece of bread, studying it before taking a bite. "Good bread. Strong hands made this. Thank you." Abby sat quietly while the men talked with Robert, speaking of water rights and grazing lands. She listened intently, understanding that their future hung on every word. The railroad meant progress to some, but out here, it could mean death to a ranch. Without access to Eagle Spring, their cattle would suffer in the dry season. Without enough grazing land, they couldn't sustain their herd. Grey Wolf finished his coffee and stood. "We watch the surveyor men. If they return, we will send word." "Much obliged," Robert said. "Your eyes on our shared water help us all." Before leaving, Grey Wolf turned to Abby. "You listen well. Not all white women know how to be still and hear." He touched his chest lightly. "Good bread comes from good heart." After their visitors departed, Robert sank heavily into his chair. Abby poured him fresh coffee, waiting. "The railroad's been pushing west," he finally said. "If they claim the water rights to Eagle Spring or cut off our access to the creek grazing." He left the sentence unfinished. "What can we do?" Abby asked softly. "Fight it in court, maybe. But railroad companies have deep pockets and friends in high places." Robert's face was grim. "Might have to sell off part of the herd if we lose the water access." Abby's heart ached at the weariness in his voice. She realized suddenly that her hasty marriage had brought her into the middle of a struggle far bigger than cruel town gossip. This was about survival, about holding on to a way of life against forces that cared nothing for the people they displaced. "We'll find a way," she said, surprising herself with the fierce certainty in her voice. "Together." Robert looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. For the first time, she saw him truly seeing her not as an obligation or an act of charity, but as a partner in the battles ahead. The sun settled behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Through the window, Abby could see the distant silhouette of cattle grazing peacefully. She understood now that she was fighting for more than just her place here. She was fighting for their home, their water, their very way of life. The cruel whispers in town seemed smaller somehow, measured against the real challenges they faced. Let them gossip, she thought. She had more important work to do. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold as Robert saddled his horse. The morning air held a bite of lingering frost, making his breath visible in small clouds. Abby stood at the kitchen door, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders as she watched him prepare to ride out. "Mind those fence lines near Eagle Spring," she said softly. "The Apache warned the surveyors might return." Robert nodded, adjusting his hat. "Should be back by midday." He paused, then added, "Coffee was good this morning." It wasn't much, but Abby treasured the small compliment as she watched him ride away. The sun climbed higher as she went about her morning chores, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and hauling water from the pump. Her arms ached less now than they had those first days, her muscles growing accustomed to the work. Once the immediate tasks were done, Abby settled at Robert's desk in the small study. She pulled out the leather-bound ledger, running her fingers over the careful columns of numbers. Her father had taught her bookkeeping in his general store, knowledge she'd thought useless after his death. Now she studied Robert's neat figures, noting how he tracked cattle counts, feed costs, and profits from sales. Some entries puzzled her. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began making notes, comparing seasons and years. The ranch's finances were more precarious than she'd realized. If they lost access to Eagle Spring, the cost of moving cattle to other water sources would eat deeply into their narrow margins. The scratch of her pencil filled the quiet house as she worked, lost in calculations until Robert's boot steps on the porch startled her. She looked up to find him in the doorway, dust coating his clothes, surprise evident on his weathered face. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing at her papers. Abby straightened, suddenly uncertain. "I hope you don't mind." "I was trying to understand the accounts better." She handed him her notes. "See here? If we could reduce feed costs in winter by storing more hay in summer, we might weather the railroad trouble better." Robert studied her calculations in silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Never thought of it that way." He didn't quite smile, but his eyes held something like respect. "Might work." That evening, as they sat down to a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Abby gathered her courage. "I've been thinking," she began carefully. "Perhaps we might invite some neighbors for Sunday fellowship." Robert's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Thomas, at the far end of the table, scowled. "The ranch needs friends," Abby continued, "especially now with the railroad coming. Good neighbors make strong allies." "They'll just come to gawk," Thomas muttered, "make fun of us behind our backs." "Maybe," Abby acknowledged. "Or maybe they'll see we have nothing to hide. That we're building something worth supporting here." Robert considered this, pushing his beans around his plate. "Suppose it couldn't hurt," he finally said, "long as you don't expect me to do much talking." The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Abby baked loaf after loaf of bread, filling the house with the warm scent of yeast and flour. She scrubbed floors, polished windows, and pressed her best tablecloth until it gleamed. Thomas stood watching her one afternoon as she struggled with the heavy trestle table that needed mending. "That leg's always been wonky," he said after a moment. Then, surprisingly, he stepped forward. "Here, let me help." Together they worked on the table, Thomas's skilled hands showing her how to brace the joints properly. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was something closer to peace than they'd had before. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Abby's stomach churned with nerves as she made final preparations. Would anyone even come? But as the morning wore on, wagons began arriving in the yard. First came the Petersons from the Mercantile, Mrs. Peterson's eyes sharp with curiosity. Then the Wilsons, whose ranch bordered theirs to the south. More families followed, some Abby recognized from town, others from more distant homesteads. She greeted each arrival at the door, welcoming them with genuine warmth despite her anxiety. "Please, come in. There's coffee fresh on the stove and bread just out of the oven." The house filled with the murmur of voices and the scrape of boots on floorboards. Abby moved among her guests, making sure coffee cups stayed full and platters of food circulated. She noticed Mrs. Peterson inspecting the cleaned windows and swept floors with pursed lips, clearly finding nothing to criticize. Before the meal, Abby called everyone to attention. "If you'll all join hands," she said clearly, "we'll ask God's blessing on this food and fellowship." A moment of hesitation rippled through the crowd, but then hands reached for hands. Abby's clear voice lifted in prayer, thanking God for neighbors and community, for the land that sustained them all, for the chance to share bread together. The meal that followed was abundant. Platters of fried chicken, bowls of beans, fresh bread, and pies. Conversation flowed more easily as people ate, discussing crops and weather, sharing news and stories. Abby saw Robert speaking quietly with Mr. Wilson about water rights, while Thomas actually smiled as he passed rolls to Sarah Wilson, a girl about his age. After the dishes were cleared, someone suggested hymns, voices lifted in familiar melodies, filling the ranch house with song. Amazing Grace floated out the open windows, across the yard where horses dozed in the afternoon sun. Abby stood in the doorway, watching the scene before her. Mrs. Peterson was teaching young Alice Wilson to piece quilt squares. Two ranchers who had been feuding over strayed cattle were sharing tobacco and laughing together on the porch. Thomas was still talking with Sarah, his usual scowl replaced by something softer. Robert appeared at her elbow. "You did good," he said quietly. "Real good." The sun was setting when the last wagon pulled away, leaving the yard quiet once more. Abby began gathering scattered cups and plates, a small smile playing at her lips. It wasn't perfect. She'd caught some whispers, seen some sideways glances. But something had shifted today. Seeds of acceptance had been planted, tiny shoots of belonging beginning to take root. Thomas helped her carry dishes to the kitchen, and for once his silence felt companionable rather than hostile. "Sarah Wilson said your pie was better than her mama's," he offered. "Reckon she was right." Abby's smile grew a little wider. Outside, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, a point of light promising that even the longest night would eventually yield to dawn. The morning after the Sunday fellowship dawned soft and gentle. Dew sparkled on the grass as Abby made her way to the chicken coop, basket in hand. The peaceful feeling from yesterday's gathering still warmed her heart, making her steps lighter than usual. She heard Robert before she saw him, the rhythmic sound of his axe splitting wood carrying across the yard. As she rounded the corner of the barn, she found him stacking fresh-cut logs, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill. "Thought we might need extra firewood," he said, noting her approach. "Yesterday's company showed me how bare the woodpile's getting." "It was nice," Abby ventured, "having the house full of people." Robert paused, axe resting against the chopping block. "Reckon it was." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Though I ain't sure how you managed to feed that many with just one stove." The comment surprised a laugh from Abby. "Well, if you'd seen me juggling those pie tins, you might not be so impressed." Robert's own chuckle joined hers, the sound rich and unexpected. For a moment, they stood sharing the simple joy of remembered chaos, both a bit startled by the ease between them. The spell broke when Thomas came around the corner, carrying empty feed sacks. He stopped short at the sight of them laughing together, his expression uncertain. But instead of his usual scowl, he cleared his throat. "Miss Abby," he said, shifting from foot to foot, "those biscuits you made yesterday. Sarah Wilson was asking after the recipe. Thought maybe." He trailed off, ears reddening. Abby's heart warmed at this small olive branch. "I'd be happy to show you how to make them," she said carefully. "It's all in the way you handle the dough." Thomas nodded quickly. Maybe later today?" "Of course." The morning continued in this gentler vein, the three of them moving through their chores with less tension than usual. Abby had just finished showing Thomas how to cut cold butter into flour when they heard hoofbeats in the yard. It was young Jimmy Peterson from town, his pony lathered from hard riding. "Telegram came for Mr. Hale," he announced importantly. "Pa said it's urgent, from the railroad office." Robert took the yellow envelope, his face growing stern as he read. "They want a meeting." "Today?" He looked at Abby. "Railroad agents in town." "I'm coming with you," Abby said firmly, surprising herself with her own boldness. When Robert started to protest, she added, "This concerns all of us now." After a long moment, Robert nodded. "Get changed then. We'll take the wagon." The ride to town was quiet, dust rising behind their wheels as the horses trotted steadily. Abby noticed Robert's hands were tight on the reins, though his face remained calm. She smoothed her best dress, grateful she'd thought to put it on. Whatever this meeting held, she wanted to present a united front. The railroad agent waited in the bank president's office, a sleek figure in an Eastern suit that looked out of place among the frontier furnishings. His smile was practiced as they entered, but his eyes were cold. "Mr. Hale," he said, rising, "and Mrs. Hale, what a pleasure. I'm Theodore Manning, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He gestured to chairs. "Please, sit." "We'll stand," Robert said flatly. Manning shrugged, still smiling. "As you wish." "I'll be direct then. The railroad is prepared to offer you a very generous sum for your ranch. $15,000. That's more than fair market value." "Not interested." "Mr. Hale, be reasonable. Progress is coming to this territory. The railroad will be built. The only question is whether you'll profit from it or—" His smile sharpened. "Or face certain unfortunate consequences." Abby felt anger rise in her chest. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Manning?" The agent's eyes flickered to her, that same smirk playing around his mouth. "Not at all, dear lady. Simply stating facts. Water rights can be complicated. Access to springs can be restricted. Cattle drives can become difficult." "My answer's still no," Robert growled. Manning leaned back, completely at ease. "Take some time to think it over. Talk it through with your lovely new wife. I'll be in town 3 more days." His tone suggested he already knew something they didn't, as if pieces were already in motion behind the scenes. The ride home was tense. The earlier piece of the morning shattered. Abby watched Robert's profile, noting the muscle jumping in his jaw. The sun was setting by the time they pulled into the yard, painting the ranch buildings in long shadows. After a quiet supper, Robert disappeared into his study. Abby finished the dishes, then found him sitting at his desk, staring at an old tin box of papers. "Sarah," he said suddenly. "My first wife. She was good with people like you. Made friends with everyone, including the Apache families who watered their horses at Eagle Spring." He pulled out a yellowed document. "She convinced me to sign this agreement with them, sharing water rights." I'd forgotten about it completely. Abby moved closer, peering at the careful signatures, Robert's, Sarah's, and several Apache marks. "This proves the spring isn't just railroad property to claim," she said slowly. "It shows established rights, shared peacefully between neighbors." Robert looked up at her, something like wonder crossing his face. "You understand what this means?" "I think I'm beginning to understand a lot of things," Abby said quietly. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and suddenly she knew with certainty that her presence here was no accident. God's hand had guided Robert to stand up in that church, had brought her to this ranch, this moment, this fight for something larger than herself. Thomas's boot steps on the porch broke the moment. He stuck his head in, concern evident on his young face. "Pa, Ryder's coming. It's our Apache neighbors." Robert stood quickly, but Abby touched his arm. "The agreement," she said. "Show them. Remember what your Sarah knew. We're stronger together than apart." Robert nodded, carefully folding the paper and tucking it in his shirt pocket. Together they walked out to meet whatever the night might bring. No longer a marriage of convenience, but a true partnership forged in shared purpose. The autumn wind whistled through the eaves of the Hale Ranch house, making the shutters rattle like angry spirits. Abby pulled her shawl tighter as she worked at the kitchen table, her needle flashing in the afternoon light as she mended one of Robert's shirts. A growing pile of patched clothing sat beside her, Thomas's work pants, ranch hands jackets, and worn socks, all given new life under her careful stitches. The pantry shelves behind her stood testament to her other labors. Rows of preserved vegetables gleamed in glass jars, dried herbs hung in neat bundles, and sacks of flour waited for the winter ahead. She had even managed to put up extra preserves, remembering the Apache families who sometimes came seeking trade during the lean months. The sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window. Robert rode in, his broad shoulders tight with tension as he dismounted. These days, he spent sunrise to sunset, riding the boundaries of their land, checking for signs of railroad men or surveyors. Each evening he returned more grim, speaking little over supper except to report what he had seen. "Found fresh tracks again," he said as he entered, hanging his hat by the door. 3 riders, maybe 4, following the creek line." Abby set aside her mending. "Railroad men?" "Can't say for certain." He ran a hand through his graying hair. But they ain't local. No one I recognize. She watched him sink into his chair, noting the exhaustion in every line of his body. An idea that had been forming in her mind all day suddenly crystallized into decision. I invited Whitefeather and his family to supper tomorrow, she said quietly. Robert's head snapped up. You what? We need friends, Robert. Real allies who know this land and care about what happens to it. She met his startled gaze steadily. Whitefeather's people have as much to lose as we do if the railroad takes the water rights. For a long moment, Robert just stared at her. Then, surprisingly, a small smile touched his lips. Sarah used to say something similar, about how neighbors were worth more than gold out here. The mention of his first wife no longer stung as it once had. Abby nodded. She was right. The next evening found Abby fussing over every detail of the meal. She had prepared venison stew, cornbread, and apple pie, hoping the simple but hearty fare would please their guests. Thomas helped her set the table, though his movements were stiff with uncertainty. You sure about this, Miss Abby? He asked, placing the last plate. Having Indians to supper? They're our neighbors, Thomas, she said firmly, and they might be the best friends we have right now. The sound of horses approaching sent them all to the door. Whitefeather dismounted first, helping his wife Morning Star down from her pony. Their teenage son, Shadow Walker, followed, along with Whitefeather's elderly father, who needed help walking to the house. Awkwardness hung thick in the air as they all gathered around the table. Abby's heart pounded as she served the food, praying she hadn't made a terrible mistake. But as the meal progressed, she noticed small changes. Morning Star complimented the stew, asking about the herbs Abby had used. Shadow Walker and Thomas found common ground discussing horse training. Whitefeather's father told stories of the land from long ago, making Robert lean forward with interest. By the time Abby served the pie, the atmosphere had transformed. Laughter came easier, and the conversation flowed naturally between English and Apache, with much gesturing and good-natured translation attempts on both sides. As they finished eating, Whitefeather grew serious. My people watch the railroad men, he said, his English careful but clear. We see where they go, what they do. We will tell you what we learn. Robert nodded solemnly. Much obliged. We'll do the same. The water belongs to the land, Whitefeather's father added in Apache, his son translating, not to men who draw lines on paper. After their guests departed, Robert touched Abby's arm as she cleared the table. That took courage, he said softly. What you did tonight. Not many would have thought to build that bridge. Warmth bloomed in her chest at his praise. I just did what needed doing. No. His hand lingered on her arm. You did more than that. You showed wisdom I didn't expect. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and something shifted between them, deep and unspoken. The moment stretched, filled with possibility. Then Robert stepped back, clearing his throat. Best get some rest. Long day tomorrow. Later that night, Abby sat brushing her hair in her room when she heard footsteps in the hall. They paused outside her door, and her heart quickened. Was Robert there? Would he knock? She held her breath, aware of every creak of the floorboards. But after what seemed an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Abby released her breath slowly, surprised by the mix of relief and disappointment that flooded her. She knelt beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. Lord, she whispered, thank you for bringing me to this place, these people. Help me be worthy of the trust they've shown. And Robert. She paused, struggling to find words for the complicated feelings in her heart. Guide us both in your wisdom. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Abby was just starting breakfast when Thomas burst through the door, his face flushed from running. Pa, he called. Miss Abby. You need to see this." They followed him down to the creek, where the water ran sweet and clear over rocks worn smooth by time. There, driven into the soft earth of the bank, stood a line of wooden stakes topped with bright red flags. Each one bore the letters WPRR, Western Pacific Railroad. Robert's face darkened as he pulled one stake from the ground. "They're marking their claim," he said grimly, "right through the heart of our grazing land." Abby stared at the other stakes, marching like tiny soldiers along the creek bank. The danger was no longer just whispers and threats. It had arrived on their doorstep, planted in their very soil. Thomas kicked at another stake. "What are we going to do, Pa?" Robert's jaw set in a hard line. "We fight," he said simply. "We fight with everything we've got." Abby touched the rough wood of the nearest stake, remembering Whitefeather's words from the night before. "The water belongs to the land." Looking at Robert and Thomas standing shoulder to shoulder, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, not just as a family, but as part of something larger. A community bound by more than paper and promises, defending something precious against those who would take it away. Dawn's pale light filtered through the kitchen windows as the Hale family gathered around the breakfast table. The wooden stakes they'd pulled from the creek lay across its surface like fallen soldiers, their red flags a stark warning against the worn tablecloth. The letters Western Pacific Railroad stood out black and bold against the weathered wood. Abby set down a plate of fresh biscuits, her hands steady despite the worry gnawing at her heart. Steam rose from the coffee cups as Robert studied the stakes with dark eyes, his jaw set in determination. "We've got no choice," he said, breaking the tense silence. "We have to fight them. Every inch of this land was earned honest, and I aim to keep it that way." Thomas pushed his eggs around his plate, his young face creased with doubt. "But Pa, how can we stand against the railroad? They've got money, lawyers, and half the territory in their pocket." "Don't matter what they've got," Robert replied firmly. "What matters is what's right." Abby placed her hand near Robert's on the table, not quite touching but close enough to feel his warmth. "The Lord rewards those who stand steadfast," she said softly. "We cannot yield simply because the path looks difficult." Robert's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of the strength they'd found in each other. Thomas watched this exchange, his expression thoughtful. The days passed in a blur of work and worry until Sunday arrived, clear and crisp. The family dressed in their best clothes for church, though Abby noticed Robert tucking his pistol beneath his coat, a habit he'd taken up since finding the stakes. The little frontier church looked peaceful in the morning light, its whitewashed walls gleaming. But as soon as they stepped inside, Abby felt the familiar sting of whispered words and sideways glances. "There she is," a woman's voice carried clearly across the sanctuary. "The fat, rejected bride. Bringing trouble wherever she goes." Another voice joined in, barely concealed behind a raised hymnal. "Poor Robert Hale. First his wife dies, now his land's threatened. That's what comes of taking in cursed goods." Abby's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, focusing on the cross above the altar. Robert's hand found the small of her back, steadying her as they made their way to their usual pew. Thomas sat closer to her than usual, as if forming a protective wall against the gossip. The organ wheezed to life, but even during the hymns, Abby heard the undertone of whispers. She fixed her attention on Reverend Johnson as he began his sermon, his words falling like balm on her wounded spirit. "Trials forge character," the Reverend proclaimed, his voice carrying to the rafters. "As fire refines gold, so do our struggles purify our faith. In times of testing, we must remember that God sees not as man sees. Where others perceive weakness, he knows our true strength." Abby felt those words sink deep into her heart. When the service ended, she squared her shoulders and moved toward the church door. Instead of hurrying past as she longed to do, she stopped to greet each person who had whispered about her. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," she said warmly to the woman who had called her cursed. "Your garden looks lovely this year." To others who had mocked her, she offered genuine smiles and kind words about their children or their health. Some turned away, but others responded with grudging nods or mumbled replies. The ride home was quiet, but Abby could feel Robert watching her. As soon as they arrived at the ranch, she threw herself into work, determined not to let the morning's hurts slow her down. The kitchen soon filled with the sweet scent of apple pies as she rolled out crust after crust. The ranch hands would need extra food for the fence mending ahead, and baking helped steady her hands and heart. When the last pie came out of the oven, golden brown and fragrant, she found Robert standing in the doorway. The setting sun painted the kitchen in amber light as he stepped closer. "You showed real grace today," he said quietly. "The way you held your head high, treated them with kindness despite their cruel words." He paused, his weathered face softening. "I'm proud to call you my wife, Abby." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket, though doubt still whispered in the back of her mind. Was he proud of her as a partner, or merely as someone who brought no shame to his name? "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just try to do what's right." Robert nodded, looking as if he wanted to say more, but the moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas called from outside about checking the north pasture before dark. Through the kitchen window, Abby watched Robert mount up and ride out with his son. Above them, storm clouds gathered over the valley, their dark masses building like mountains in the sky. The air felt heavy with the promise of rain, matching the weight of uncertainty that pressed down on them all. She turned back to her pies, laying them out to cool on the windowsill. Whatever storms approached, whether from nature or man, she would face them with the same dignity she'd shown in church. The townsfolk's whispers might sting, but they could not shake her resolve to prove herself worthy of the life God had given her and the man who had claimed her at the altar. The first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the valley as darkness began to fall, nature's own reminder that greater challenges lay ahead. The storm struck without mercy. Rain hammered against the windows like thrown pebbles, while lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Wind howled through the valley, finding every crack and crevice in the old ranch house. Abby jerked awake at a tremendous crash. Through her window, a flash of lightning revealed loose shingles flying from the barn roof like startled birds. The clock on her bedside table showed just past midnight. Boots thundered up the stairs. Robert's voice carried over the storm. "Abby!" the creaks rising. "We need help with the livestock!" She was already pulling on her boots when Thomas appeared in her doorway, rain dripping from his hat. "The pens near the creek are flooding." "Pa says hurry!" Abby grabbed her shawl and followed them into the tempest. The wind nearly knocked her flat as she stepped outside. Rain stung her face, and her skirts grew heavy with mud within seconds. Lightning revealed the creek, usually so docile, now a roaring monster clawing at its banks. "The sheep!" Thomas shouted above the wind. "They're trapped in the lower pen!" Robert was already splashing through the rising water, his broad shoulders hunched against the storm. Abby and Thomas followed, fighting their way toward the frightened bleating. The sheep huddled together, water swirling around their legs. Abby grabbed the gate, her fingers numb with cold as she worked the latch. Robert and Thomas waded in, pushing and pulling the panicked animals toward higher ground. "Mind that, you!" Abby called out, spotting one struggling against the current. Without thinking, she lifted her skirts and waded in, helping guide the frightened animal to safety. Hours blurred together as they worked. They moved the cattle next, then the horses, leading them all to the safety of the upper pasture. Abby's arms ached from carrying frightened lambs, her dress caked with mud to her waist. Lightning revealed Thomas watching her with something like amazement as she helped birth a calf that had chosen this chaos to enter the world. Her hands were steady as she worked, speaking soft words of encouragement to the straining mother. "Never seen anyone handle a breech birth so calm," he said later, as they hurried to reinforce the barn door against the wind. "My uncle raised cattle," she replied, holding the lantern while he hammered. "I learned young." Dawn finally broke, pale and exhausted. The storm moved on, leaving behind a ranch that looked like it had been through a war. Shingles littered the yard, fences lay broken, and mud covered everything. The three of them stood on the porch, watching the sun rise. Abby swayed slightly with fatigue, and both Robert and Thomas reached to steady her at the same time. Their eyes met over her head, something unspoken passing between them. "You should rest," Thomas said gruffly, but his tone held new respect. "We can handle the morning chores." "We all need rest," Robert declared. "The work will wait an hour." Inside, Abby insisted on making coffee before sleeping. They sat at the kitchen table, mud-splattered and weary, but somehow closer than before. Thomas actually smiled when she passed him a cup, and Robert's hand brushed hers with deliberate gentleness. As the days passed and sun returned to the valley, Abby watched the ranch slowly recover. New shingles appeared on the barn roof, broken fences were mended, the mud dried and cracked away. One evening, as they finished supper, Abby gathered her courage. "I think we should have another fellowship gathering," she said, "to lift everyone's spirits after the storm." Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I don't know, Abby. With the railroad breathing down our necks." "Maybe that's exactly why we need it," she pressed gently. "To remind everyone what community means." Thomas, to her surprise, spoke up. "She's right, Pa. We could use some friendly faces." Robert studied them both, then nodded slowly. "All right. But we'll need to be careful." The next few days buzzed with preparation. Abby baked until the kitchen shelves groaned with pies and bread. Thomas helped clean the barn for overflow seating, while Robert sent out invitations. Sunday afternoon arrived bright and clear. Wagons began rolling in early, bringing neighbors from across the valley. Townsfolk came too, their curiosity seemingly stronger than their prejudice. Even the Apache leader arrived with his family, bearing gifts of woven blankets. The barn had been transformed with lanterns and autumn flowers. Long tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family. Children played in the yard, while their parents talked and laughed. Abby moved through it all like a dream, greeting guests, directing the food layout, making sure everyone felt welcome. She noticed Robert watching her with quiet pride as she helped the Apache women arrange their dishes alongside the others. After the meal, someone brought out a fiddle. Hymns rose into the rafters, but this time they were accompanied by genuine joy. Amazing Grace had never sounded sweeter than it did in that barn, sung by voices that finally felt like family. Standing in the doorway, watching the scene before her, Abby felt it deep in her bones. Belonging. This was her home. These were her people. The ache of past rejections began to fade, like old bruises healing. As the sun set and the last wagons departed, Robert found her in the kitchen putting away leftovers. "You've done something special here," he said softly. "Brought light back to this place." His eyes held hers with such warmth that Abby felt her cheeks flush. Her heart fluttered as she realized how much she had grown to care for this quiet, honorable man. This was no longer just a marriage of convenience or rescue. At least not for her. Later they sat together in the living room, the lamp casting a gentle glow. Thomas played a quiet tune on his harmonica, while Robert read from the Bible. Abby's needlework lay forgotten in her lap as she savored the peaceful moment. The room felt warmer somehow, filled with an ease that had been missing before. Even Thomas seemed more relaxed, his usual scowl replaced by contentment as he played. Beyond the windows, Darkness gathered thick and deep. None of them noticed the shadows that moved outside, or the men who studied the ranch house with calculating eyes. Their fellowship had brought light and belonging, but it had also drawn attention they did not want. The night settled over the Hale Ranch like a heavy blanket. Stars winked overhead, and crickets chirped their evening songs. Inside the house, Abby finished washing the last of the supper dishes, while Robert reviewed the ranch ledger by lamplight. Thomas had just stepped outside to check on the horses one final time before bed. The peaceful moment shattered with Thomas's frantic shout. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" Robert bolted from his chair, knocking it backwards. Abby dropped her dish rag, her heart lurching as orange light flickered through the kitchen window. They burst through the door into the night air. Flames already climbed the barn's wooden walls, hungry tongues of fire licking toward the roof. The horses inside screamed in terror, their shadows thrashing against the inferno. Robert and Thomas sprinted toward the burning structure. "The water barrel!" Robert bellowed. "Abby, help us form a line!" Abby ran to the barrel, her hands shaking as she filled the first bucket. The heat of the fire pressed against her face like a furnace door thrown open. Smoke burned her eyes and throat as she passed buckets to Thomas, who threw water at the base of the flames. Robert fought with the barn door, trying to reach the trapped animals. The metal latch had grown too hot to touch. He wrapped his hand in his shirt and yanked it open, releasing a blast of scorching air and thick smoke. "The horses!" Thomas charged forward, but Robert held him back. "Too dangerous." Robert's voice cracked with anguish. Inside, they could hear the animals thrashing and screaming. Abby's arms ached as she hauled bucket after bucket. Sweat and tears mingled on her face while she prayed desperately between breaths. The fire roared louder, drowning out even the terrified horses. Their efforts seemed pitiful against its fury. A tremendous crack split the night. "The roof!" Thomas shouted. "Get back!" They scrambled away as the barn's roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash. Sparks exploded skyward like 1,000 fireflies. The horses' screams cut off abruptly, leaving only the fire's hungry roar. Robert, Thomas, and Abby could only watch helplessly as the flames devoured everything. The heat drove them further back until they stood in the yard, covered in soot and gasping for breath. The fire painted their faces in shades of orange and shadow. By the time dawn crept over the hills, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins. The morning light revealed the full scope of destruction, charred timbers, melted metal, and the bitter truth they had been avoiding all night. The bodies of their horses lay among the ashes. Neighbors began arriving as word spread. They stood in clusters, whispering and staring at the devastation. Abby moved among them, offering coffee she had made with trembling hands, trying to keep busy so she wouldn't have to think about the horses' final moments. Then she heard it, a woman's voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Ever since that fat bride came, Robert's luck has soured." "Cursed, that's what she is," another replied. "The rejected bride brings misfortune wherever she goes." The coffee pot nearly slipped from Abby's grasp. She steadied it, but couldn't steady her heart as more whispers reached her ears. "Poor Robert, taken her in out of pity, and look what it's brought him. First the railroad threats, now this. Mark my words, that woman will be the ruin of the Hale Ranch." Each word struck like a physical blow. Abby set down the coffee pot and fled toward the house, her vision blurring with tears. She barely made it inside before the sobs overtook her. Up in her room, Abby collapsed beside her bed, pressing her face into the quilt to muffle her crying. The neighbor's cruel words echoed in her mind, mixing with memories of past rejections and humiliations. What if they were right? What if she truly was cursed? Everything had gone wrong since she arrived at the ranch. The smell of smoke still clung to her dress as she knelt there, whispering broken prayers through her tears. "Please, Lord, show me what to do. If I'm bringing destruction to this family, give me the strength to leave." Through her smoke-stained window, she could see the ranch yard. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood stark against the sky, a monument to their losses. The sight sent fresh pain through her heart. The ranch looked wounded, broken, as though all hope had been burned away with the barn. Downstairs, she heard the heavy tread of boots as Robert paced the floor. Once, twice, 3 times across the room. Then the sound of him sinking into his chair by the fire. When she crept to the top of the stairs, she saw him sitting there, his broad shoulders bowed under the weight of their loss. His hands hung limply between his knees, head lowered in defeat. Thomas's anger exploded suddenly in the kitchen. The crack of his fist hitting the wall made Abby jump. "It was the railroad men," he shouted. "Had to be. First their threats, now this?" "We can't prove it." Robert's voice came quiet and weary. "Not without witnesses." "So we just let them destroy everything." Another thud as Thomas struck the wall again. "We have to do something, Pa." Silence fell heavy between father and son. Abby retreated back to her room, closing the door softly. She sank to her knees beside the bed again, clasping her hands so tight her knuckles went white. "Dear God," she whispered, "please don't let my presence here be the cause of their suffering. Show me the path forward. Give me wisdom to know if I should stay or go." But no clear answer came. Outside her window, the last wisps of smoke rose from the ruins of the barn. The ranch that had finally begun to feel like home now looked as broken as her heart felt. Everything they had built together, the fellowship, the sense of family, the fragile trust, seemed to have turned to ashes along with the barn. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but Abby remained on her knees, tears falling silently as she prayed for guidance. Below, she could still hear Thomas's angry pacing and Robert's heavy silence. The weight of loss and blame pressed down on all of them like a smothering blanket, threatening to extinguish what little hope remained. Morning crept over the hills, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pearl gray. Abby stood at her window, watching the first light touch the blackened ruins of the barn. The sight made her chest ache with fresh grief and guilt. Below, ranch hands moved like shadows through the yard, clearing away charred timber and twisted metal. She turned from the window, unable to bear the sight any longer. Her gaze fell on the simple trunk at the foot of her bed, the same one she had brought as a bride just months ago. Now it would serve to carry her away from this place she had dared to call home. With trembling hands, she began folding her dresses, tucking them carefully between sheets of brown paper. Each item she packed felt heavy with memories. The blue calico she had worn while hosting their first fellowship supper, the work apron stained with evidence of learning to milk cows. Tears splashed silently onto the fabric as she worked. A letter to her sister in Kansas lay half-written on the small desk. "Dearest Mary," it began, "I find myself in need of shelter once again." The words blurred before her eyes. She had written so bravely of building a new life here, of finding purpose despite the town's scorn. Now those dreams lay in ashes, like the barn. She heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs, his tread slower and heavier than usual. When he appeared in her doorway, the sight of her trunk stopped him short. "What are you doing?" His voice was rough from smoke and lack of sleep. Abby kept folding, afraid to meet his eyes. "What needs to be done?" she whispered. "I cannot stay here and bring more misfortune to your family." "Abby." Robert stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. "You cannot believe what those gossips say." "Can I not?" She finally looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Since I came here, everything has gone wrong. The railroad threats, the burning of the barn, perhaps they are right. Perhaps I am cursed." "You are not cursed," Robert said firmly. "You are my wife." The tenderness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. A wife should bring blessing to her husband's house, not destruction. Your son was right to doubt your choice in marrying me. Abby, please. Robert reached for her hand, but she pulled away, returning to her packing. My sister has a farm near Topeka, she said, her voice trembling. She will take me in until I can find my own way. Before Robert could argue further, they heard a commotion in the yard. Thomas's voice carried up to them. Pa! The Apache leader is here, says it's urgent. Robert hesitated, torn between stopping Abby and attending to this new development. This conversation is not finished, he said firmly, then turned and hurried downstairs. Abby followed more slowly, wiping her eyes with her apron. In the kitchen, she found Robert and Thomas speaking with the Apache leader, a man called Running Cloud. His usual dignity was charged with unusual excitement as he spread several yellowed papers on the kitchen table. These documents, Running Cloud said, tapping the papers with one finger. They speak of water rights. Your first wife. She made agreement with our people. Robert leaned forward, studying the faded writing. Sarah signed this? His voice caught on his late wife's name. I never knew. She was wise woman, Running Cloud nodded. Saw a need for peace between neighbors. Agreement gives both peoples right to water. Railroad cannot take what is already given. Abby moved closer, drawn by the intensity in the Apache leader's voice. The documents were official, bearing proper seals and signatures. Her experience with Robert's ledgers helped her recognize their legal weight. This could stop them, she breathed, hope flickering to life in her chest. With proof of prior water rights, the railroad's claims would have no standing. Robert shook his head. The townsfolk will never accept documents signed with the Apache. They will say they are false. Then I will make them listen. The words came from Abby with surprising strength. All three men turned to look at her. You? Thomas asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Yes. Abby straightened her shoulders, certainty growing within her. I have nothing left to lose. They already mock me, already blame me for every misfortune. Let them do their worst. I will speak the truth. Robert studied her face intently. Abby, you do not have to do this. The risk dash. The risk is worth taking, she interrupted gently. This ranch is worth fighting for. These agreements are right and true, and I will not let fear or shame silence me. Running Cloud nodded slowly, approval warming his dark eyes. You have warrior's heart, woman. Not all battles are fought with weapons. As evening settled over the ranch, Abby sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread before her in a pool of lamplight. She read each line carefully, making notes, building her argument piece by piece. The ranch house was quiet except for the scratch of her pencil and the soft crackle of the fire. Robert stood in the doorway watching her work, his face a mixture of pride and concern. The woman bent over those papers was not the timid bride who had arrived at his ranch. Hardship and determination had forged something stronger in her, like iron tempered in fire. You should rest, he said softly. Abby shook her head, not looking up. There is too much to prepare. If we are to save this ranch, these documents must speak clearly. Every detail matters. Robert moved to stand behind her chair, looking down at her neat handwriting. I never meant for you to carry this burden. Perhaps that is why I must, Abby replied, finally meeting his gaze. You gave me shelter when others mocked me. You offered dignity when they gave scorn. Now I can help protect what you have built. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the documents that could change their future. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkened valley. But inside, Abby bent again to her task, her resolve hardening with each word she read. She would face the railroad men. She would face the townspeople who had rejected her. She would stand before them all and speak truth, no matter the cost. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt strangely calm. Like the gray dawn after the fire, clarity had come at last. Robert remained by her side, silent but steadfast, as she worked through the night. The documents spread before them held more than just water rights. They held hope, justice, and perhaps a chance to prove that love and courage could overcome even the deepest scorn. Dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as 3 riders set out from the Hale Ranch. Abby sat straight in her saddle, the precious documents secured in her satchel. Robert rode on her right, Thomas on her left, their presence giving her strength even as her heart fluttered with nervousness. The morning air held an autumn chill, making their horses' breath steam in white puffs. Abby pulled her shawl tighter, grateful for its warmth. As they approached town, she could see people already gathering outside the courthouse, their faces turning to watch the Hales approach. "Remember," Robert said quietly, "you don't have to do this." Abby squared her shoulders. "Yes, I do." They dismounted at the hitching post, and Abby smoothed her skirts with trembling hands. The courthouse steps loomed before her, more intimidating than they had ever seemed before. Already she could hear the whispers starting. "Look who's here, the fat rejected bride." Bringing more trouble, no doubt. "Whole valley's gone wrong since she came." Thomas surprised her by offering his arm. "Pay them no mind," he muttered. "They're just scared of change." Inside, the courthouse was packed. Ranchers in dusty boots stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers in their proper suits. Women in their Sunday best fanned themselves in the stuffy air, their eyes following Abby's every move. At the front of the room, the railroad agent stood in his fine Eastern suit, looking impatient and superior. Judge Harrison sat at his bench, gavel in hand. "This town meeting will come to order," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're here to discuss the railroad's proposal for land acquisition in the valley." The railroad agent stepped forward, his patent leather shoes gleaming. "Gentlemen and ladies," he added with a condescending nod, "the Great Western Railroad offers generous compensation for the necessary rights of way. Progress cannot be stopped. Those who cooperate will profit. Those who resist—" He let the threat hang unspoken. Robert began to rise, but Abby touched his arm. With careful movements, she stood and walked to the front of the room. The whispers grew louder, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead. "If I may speak," she said, her voice clear despite her racing heart. The judge raised his eyebrows but nodded. "The floor is yours, Mrs. Hale." Abby opened her satchel and withdrew the documents, holding them up for all to see. "These papers tell a story that everyone in this room needs to hear. A story about agreements made in good faith, about neighbors helping neighbors, about justice that goes deeper than money." The railroad agent snorted. "We haven't time for fairy tales, madam." "This is no fairy tale," Abby replied firmly. "These documents, signed and sealed by proper authority, show that Sarah Hale, Robert's first wife, established a legal water use agreement with our Apache neighbors years ago. The creek and grazing lands the railroad wants to take are already bound by prior claim." A commotion at the door drew all eyes. The Apache leader, Running Cloud, stood in the entrance, dignified in his silence. Several other tribal elders flanked him. Their presence sent a ripple through the crowd. "These savages have no standing here?" the railroad agent sneered. "They have every standing," Abby's voice rang out stronger. "The agreement bears the signature of the territorial governor himself. It guarantees shared water rights between the Hale Ranch and the Apache people, rights that cannot be superseded by your railroad's claims." She held up the papers, turning slowly so everyone could see the official seals. "I have studied these documents carefully. They are legal and binding. Sarah Hale was a wise woman who saw the value in cooperation rather than conflict. She built bridges instead of walls." "And what would you know about building anything?" someone called out. "You're just the woman no one wanted." Laughter rippled through the room, but Abby didn't flinch. "Yes, I am the woman who was rejected at the altar. I am the woman you mock and whisper about, but I am also the woman standing here now, fighting for what is right, not just for the Hale Ranch, but for all of us." She turned to face the crowd directly. "This valley thrives because we help each other. Because we share what God has given us. The water, the grass, the good earth itself. The railroad offers money, but at what cost? They would divide us, turn neighbor against neighbor, destroy the very things that make this land worth fighting for." Running Cloud stepped forward, his voice deep and measured. "The paper speaks truth. Sarah Hale was honorable woman. Agreement brings peace between peoples. Railroad brings only greed." The agent's face had grown red with anger. "This is preposterous. You cannot seriously consider some old agreement with Indians." "Those Indians are our neighbors," Abby cut in. "They have helped us, warned us when you sent men to burn our barn, shared their knowledge of the land." "You dare accuse the railroad of arson?" the agent sputtered. "We all know what happened," Thomas spoke up suddenly. "Just like we know you've been threatening other ranchers. Using fear instead of fair dealing." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. Other voices joined in, sharing stories of railroad threats and suspicious accidents. Judge Harrison rapped his gavel. "Order! Order in this court." When the room quieted, he gestured to Abby. "Let me see those documents." With steady steps, Abby approached the bench and handed over the papers. The judge studied them carefully, adjusting his spectacles. "These appear to be in order," he said finally. "The territorial governor's seal is genuine. The water rights agreement is legal and binding." The railroad agent stepped forward. "Your Honor, surely." "The law is the law," Judge Harrison cut him off. "Prior claim stands. The railroad cannot seize land or water rights already legally granted to others." A cheer went up from the ranchers in the crowd. The agent's face twisted with fury as he gathered his papers and stormed out, his fine boots clicking against the floorboards. Abby stood still, hardly daring to believe it was over. Then she felt Robert's hand on her shoulder, solid and warm. When she turned to look at him, his eyes shone with pride. The courthouse slowly emptied, but now the whispers had a different tone. People nodded to Abby as they passed, some even stopping to shake her hand. The women who had mocked her looked away, shamefaced. Running Cloud approached with his elders. "You speak with strong heart," he told Abby. "Sarah Hale would be proud to call you daughter." Tears pricked at Abby's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you for standing with us," she said softly. "We stand together," Running Cloud replied. "As neighbors should." Outside, the autumn sun had climbed high, warming the courthouse steps. Abby paused there, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time since coming to the valley, she felt truly seen, not as the rejected bride, not as an object of scorn, but as herself. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "That was, well, you did good in there, real good." "Much obliged," Abby said softly, touching his arm. Robert helped her mount her horse, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. As they rode home, the valley stretched before them, beautiful and unchanged, yet somehow different. The land that had once seemed to mock her now felt like it was welcoming her home. The whispers that followed them now spoke not of rejection, but of respect. Abby rode tall in her saddle, the empty satchel light against her side, her heart full of quiet triumph. She had found her voice, her strength and her place, not just on the Hale Ranch, but in the valley itself. The railroad agent's face twisted with rage as he jabbed a finger toward Abby. "This is absurd! You cannot possibly allow the testimony of this woman to derail progress." "That woman," Robert's voice boomed across the courthouse, "is my wife." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as ranchers began rising to their feet. Jim Tucker, whose spread bordered the Hale Ranch, stepped forward. "We've all seen your kind of progress," he declared. "Threatening honest folks, burning barns in the night. Well, we ain't standing for it no more." Other voices joined in, growing louder. "That's right," someone shouted. Get him out of here." The agent's confident smile faltered as he glanced around the room. Where moments ago he had commanded attention with his fine suit and smooth words, now he faced a sea of angry faces. "Sheriff," called Bill Henderson, who ran the mercantile, "ain't it your duty to protect legal documents? Those papers Mrs. Hale brought look mighty official to me." Sheriff Matthews adjusted his gun belt, studying the agent with narrowed eyes. "Those seals are genuine, sure enough. And attempted arson is a serious crime in these parts." "You have no proof," the agent sputtered, but the sheriff cut him off. "Maybe not enough for court," Matthews said slowly, "but enough to know you ain't welcome here no more. I reckon it's time for you to leave town." The room erupted in shouts of agreement. The agent grabbed his hat, face mottled red with fury. "This isn't over," he spat. "The railroad doesn't forget its enemies." "Get out!" several voices roared. The agent stormed toward the door, his polished boots striking the floorboards like angry hammers. He paused in the doorway, turning back with venom in his eyes. "You'll regret this. All of you." The door slammed behind him. For a moment, silence held the room. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly the courthouse filled with cheers. Abby's legs trembled as the tension drained from her body. She sank onto a nearby bench, her heart still racing. Robert was there instantly, taking both her hands in his weathered grip. "My beloved wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the noise. "You are the strongest woman I know." Fresh cheers broke out. Abby felt tears threatening as she looked up into his face, seeing such pride and tenderness there. For the first time, she truly believed his love was real, not mere kindness or duty. Thomas pushed through the crowd to stand beside them. "Pa's right," he said gruffly. "You showed real courage up there, Mother." The word hung in the air between them, precious as morning dew. Abby squeezed his hand, too moved to speak. People pressed around them now, neighbors, townsfolk, even those who had scorned her before. The Apache elders offered dignified nods of approval before departing. Judge Harrison himself came down from the bench to shake her hand. "Well done, Mrs. Hale," he said warmly. "You've done this valley a great service today." As the excitement gradually settled, people began drifting out into the autumn afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the valley in rich golden light, as Abby, Robert, and Thomas mounted their horses for the ride home. They rode in comfortable silence, the air crisp with approaching evening. Abby watched shadows stretch across the familiar landscape, the creek where she had learned to wash clothes, the rolling pastures where she now helped with the cattle, the distant mountains that had seemed so threatening when she first arrived. As they crested the last rise before the ranch, Abby caught her breath. A line of wagons wound along the road toward their property. She recognized Matt Wilson's team, the Hendersons' buckboard, and several others. "What in heaven's name?" Robert muttered, spurring his horse forward. They found the yard filled with neighbors unloading supplies. Fresh-cut lumber was already stacked near the burned barn. A pair of young colts pranced in the corral, while chickens scratched in a new coop. "Thought you might need some help rebuilding," Jim Tucker called out, "seeing as how you folks stood up to that railroad man for all of us." His wife Sarah stepped forward, carrying a covered dish. "I brought supper," she said kindly to Abby. "Figured you might be too tired to cook after today." More wagons arrived as the sun set, the Petersons bringing tools, the Wilsons with a load of hay, even the mercantile owner's wife with cloth for new curtains. Children ran laughing between the adults, while men discussed construction plans for the barn. Abby moved through it all in a daze of gratitude, accepting hugs and handshakes from people who had once turned away from her in town. The kitchen filled with women sharing recipes and gossip, treating her as one of their own at last. The aroma of coffee and Sarah Tucker's beef stew filled the house. Someone started singing an old hymn, and others joined in. Abby stood in the doorway, watching Thomas joke with the other young men as they arranged lanterns for the evening work. Robert moved among their neighbors, his usual reserve softened by genuine warmth. The night grew deep, but no one seemed eager to leave. The kitchen rang with laughter as stories were shared. Children fell asleep in corners while their parents talked. The burned barn still stood as a dark shadow, but now it seemed less a mark of defeat than a promise of renewal. Abby stirred the stew pot, adding more water to feed the crowd. Her heart felt as full as the kitchen, overflow with a joy she had never dared to imagine. Here, finally, was the belonging she had longed for all her life. "Need any help?" Robert's voice came softly behind her. She turned to find him watching her with that same tender pride he had shown in the courthouse. "I reckon I've got everything well in hand," she replied, smiling. He stepped closer, taking the ladle from her and setting it aside. "You surely do," he murmured. "You've got us all well in hand, Abby Hale." The way he said her name made her cheeks warm. Around them, conversation and laughter continued, but in that moment they might have been alone in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me that day in the church, for giving me a chance to belong." Robert shook his head. "No, my love. Thank you for showing us all what real strength looks like, what real love can do." From the main room came Thomas's laugh, bright and unfettered. The sound of hammering echoed from outside, where men worked by lamplight to clear the burned timber. Women's voices rose and fell like music around the kitchen table. The valley's first frost might come tonight, Abby thought, but here in the warmth of their home, spring had already arrived in their hearts. Winter settled over the valley like a gentle blessing, laying a pristine blanket of snow across the newly rebuilt barn. Through frosted window panes, golden lamplight spilled onto the evening snow, casting warm squares of brightness against the white ground. Inside the ranch house, Abby stirred a pot of rich beef stew, the savory aroma filling every corner. The rhythmic thud of Robert's axe splitting wood echoed from outside, while Thomas sat near the fire, his skilled hands working leather harnesses with practiced care. The kitchen door opened, bringing a swirl of cold air as neighbors stamped snow from their boots. The Apache leader and his family arrived bearing gifts of dried berries. Soon the house hummed with conversation in multiple languages, bridges built through shared meals and respect. After Abby led them in prayer, Robert stood, his cup raised high. "To my wife," he declared, voice thick with emotion, "who turned mockery into honor and made this house a true home." "To Mother," Thomas added quietly, the word falling like a precious gift. Abby pressed her hand to her heart, tears spilling down her cheeks as she met her stepson's sincere gaze. Later, she and Robert stepped out onto the porch. The night sky blazed with countless stars, the world hushed beneath its snowy blanket. Robert's arm settled around her shoulders, drawing her close. "I cannot imagine life without you," he whispered into her hair. "You've brought such light to our home." Abby smiled, remembering the cruel whispers of fat, rejected bride that now seemed as distant as summer rain. Here, wrapped in her husband's embrace, she was simply herself, cherished wife, beloved mother, and a living bridge between divided peoples. Above them, the stars shone like promises kept, while inside their home, lamplight beckoned them back to warmth and family. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.